Hello there, and welcome to this episode 7 of the For All That podcast with me, Andrew Tickell, him, Michael Greenwell, and joining us today we have two guests to discuss the whole gamut of what's been going on this week in Scottish politics, but also about the future of Scotland. Our first guest is Rory Scothorne, who's a co-founder of National Collective, who joins us from the other side of the Atlantic, which is quite a significant leap for him. Welcome, Rory.
Hello, thank you very much for having me on.
You're very welcome. And our second guest today is Kevin Williamson, who is a poet and also is very much involved with the Bella Caledonia blog. And I'm sure lots of you have read some of his thoughts. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Cheers, Andrew.
And now we just go launch straight in, I think, with the first story of the week. And we've got you pair are probably the most creative guests I think we've had on. Michael and I are the Philistines for this particular podcast. This week, there have been significant developments in terms of, I suppose, what you might call the institutional machinery behind funding creative works in Scotland, with the resignation of Andrew Dixon after a long period of disgruntlement and dissatisfaction from artists in Scotland about the direction and tone of Creative Scotland. Kevin, you are a poet, so what do you think about these developments and how it's all gone for Creative Scotland as this new body?
It's been a turbulent couple of months for Creative Scotland. I mean, they're under pressure for some of our leading artists. I think it was David Gregg and Liz Lockhead and Janice Galloway. They've all basically opened fire on what started off really the rumblings over the theatre funding and not back in continuous funding of theatre groups. And that got people's backs up. It's disrupted what could be longer term projects. I think it's a bit of a sideshow at the moment, and Andrew Dixon's resignation, to me, it doesn't actually change anything in the actual structure of the funding body. I mean, it is the biggest funder of arts in Scotland, and it is quite an important funder, especially for literature, theatre, dance and film, because a lot of these arts will struggle without actually the public funds put in at the grassroots level. So whatever happens at Creative Scotland is going to have ramifications for most people who work in the arts or are creative. I don't even like calling it an industry, because this is part of the problem.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I think many people are perhaps haven't followed this perhaps as closely as yourself in terms of the developments and the real reason why artists are feeling disgruntled about Creative Scotland. Now, you made reference there to funding structures, and meaning that theatres were getting very, I think, short-term funds, meaning that they couldn't work on a constant basis. But could you enlarge a wee bit on that idea of tone?
Creative Scotland, you have to go back to its roots and where it came from, how it evolved out of the Scottish Arts Council and who controls it, who appoints it. And there's nothing actually changed in the direction this week, despite Andrew Dixon's resignation. The structures are still intact that were set up. The way it operates is not changing as far as the macro policy. Yeah, they'll have more consultation with artists, and I think there will be closer relationship between the funding bodies and artists because they're trying to break down the barriers. But essentially, what we're seeing through Creative Scotland is a move to try and marketise culture in Scotland, and this is what's really got people's backs up. As writers want to write. They don't want to present huge detailed proposals about how they're getting half their funding from these private organisations, and theatres don't want to do it. You bog down in bureaucracy. You just want the money to create, to get the time to create. And this is a problem. This has not been addressed, and this is something that it's not even party political, because let's face it, the Labour Party started this when they were in power, and the SNP have continued it. So both governments are equally responsible for the direction that Creative Scotland have taken. I think it's come to a crunch now, because basically artists and writers and everybody have basically put forward a series of demands saying this can't continue if we want to actually really nurture arts and not marketise them. So at the moment, the marketeers are running the show, and how that's going to change is going to have to come from political direction. It's going to need Fiona Hislop and the people at the top of culture in Scotland to actually recognise what's happening and why it's not the most effective way of encouraging arts in Scotland.
There's two questions about budget I'm interested in. First of all, who decides what Creative Scotland's budget will be? And secondly, who decides how it will be allocated?
That'll be the Creative Scotland Board will decide how it's allocated in each department, and the Scottish Government will assign. So, I mean, how it gets divvied up department, it tends to go on, there's a measure that's been drawn up for a number of years, and so it doesn't really change that much, except when they brought in the film. There was a big upheaval when it was begun, where they took out opera and the 5 national companies and brought in Scottish Screen to fund film, which has been a disaster, really, an absolute catastrophe, bringing Scottish film into Creative Scotland. Scottish film is really struggling to establish itself because we don't have a studio. I could talk. I was actually out with a film director who's directing the film Filth with James McAvoy on it just last night. He was explaining they had to film all the indoor scenes in Sweden. The outdoor stuff was done in Edinburgh, but they had to go over to Sweden because Scotland doesn't have a studio. It's unbelievable that we haven't invested money in a film studio in this country. Film being the primary art for taking your ideas out with your own country. Everybody knows that in every other country, but for Scotland, it's been neglected. I could go on. There's so many things wrong with Creative Scotland, the structures and the way it operates. It's got a lot of good people working in it, and I think that a lot of them are taking unfair criticism. It's the structures that's the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was interested in this. Obviously, it's a great pressure, actually, across all different areas about marketisation. You made reference there, Kevin, sort of justifying things in money terms, about sort of the kind of white heat of industry transformed into sort of the screen in terms of art, about using that as a kind of way to press forward a kind of idea of Scotland at the forefront, and all of that kind of new management babble, which people feel quite hostile about. Rory, I wanted to bring you in there. You are a co-founder of National Collective, which is, I think, describes itself as a collective of artists for independence. I wonder what you think about that, about the intrusion of economic calculation into the artistic process, or is it a necessary way, as some people might argue, to justify continuing arts funding in what is already a very squeezed fiscal field?
I think Ian Jack wrote something very good on this in The Guardian recently. I got it as part of the Send Scot Bulletin, which is a social enterprise Scotland bulletin that's sent out. In it, he points to Alan Bennett's most recent work, which is, I can't remember the name right now, but he begins with this kind of scathing criticism of how the state and the role of the state for providing public services, because they ought to be provided, has been replaced by public services being sold to people, essentially, or the citizen as the consumer. And I think this is particularly relevant for arts, where you see this marketisation of arts and this idea that arts have to be kind of treated as a consumer good by the people that are funding them, the people that are producing them. We have to explain why this is going to sell, why this is going to be, why this deserves funding for this. And it doesn't strike me that arts is being treated as a public good anymore. It's being treated as a consumer good, like everything else, like our water services, like our electricity, like all of these things that should be public services are being marketized, as you say. And I think we need to get back to this idea of art as a public good. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with National Collective, I guess, which is that we're trying to grasp hold of Scotland's innate cultural self-confidence. Because we do have, I think arts is one of the things where Scotland can be confident about itself and ought to be confident about itself. We've got a fantastic music scene. We've got fantastic writers. We've got great films, great filmmakers. That's something that we're trying to harness for independence, and this idea of creating a new country. That's the ultimate art of creation, almost. And so this is where the kind of the state and the arts and public service kind of all seems to meet in the middle, I think, which is this idea of coming together to create a new set of rules for governing ourselves on it.
Yeah.
And sorry, do you want to?
No, I was just going to ask about the timing of this, and I imagine maybe Michael and Kevin may have something to say about this, because obviously much of the attention in Scottish public debate, at least in terms of the press and folk like ourselves, is tending towards 2014, towards independence. And since devolution, you've seen the emergence of sort of different institutions promoting an idea of national artistic life, like National Theatre of Scotland, where I worked for a wee stint in the past. Those kind of institutions, and yet we have Creative Scotland here promoting this vast sort of backlash against it, a sense of not really realising the potential that we have. I wonder if that's maybe a problem or perhaps a less than ideal situation for those like Rory who are wanting to promote this idea of a sort of Creative Scotland coming together, seeing our potential and making the most of it. And if we're not making the most of it now, then it's not the best poster for making the most of it through independence. Maybe Michael, I'd bring you in here. You've been a quiet wee boy thus far.
Well, No, I think it's better to bring Kev in there, actually.
Okay, fair enough. Kevin,
Passing
I
the-
don't know if that resonates with you, that kind of anxiety that I was trying to capture.
Yes and no. I mean, writers and artists are a prickly bunch and don't like to be heralded into any collective venture very easily.
It's like herding cats.
Yeah, it is. It is like herding cats because people want to do their own thing, and you don't want. I mean, I know I often feel this internal tug between my politics and my art. I know they'll always be enmeshed, but I don't want my art ever to be slave to my politics. And this is really important to me, especially collectively. I'll do whatever I want. If I want to work on a project, I'll work on a project. If sometimes if it becomes part of a bigger political thing, then yes, you can look at it. Will my art fit in that? It's not the other way around. And I think a lot of writers and artists, musicians will look at what's happening with the bigger picture with Scotland and will tentatively put their support or opposition on record at this stage, if that's what you're originally asking around the question of national collective. I know a number of artists have done. They've nailed the colours to the mast. I think you'll only really see a real cultural, a movement, a cultural movement for independence emerge in 2014. I think you'll see some people who are prepared to, put their foot in the water straight away. But I'm hoping, and I suspect it's not any different from the rest of the population. I think people will weigh things up, and I think something really big's going to happen in 2014. Collectively in the consciousness of people in Scotland, and it will be the only thing discussed, politically. It'll dominate everything. It'll dominate all discussions as the date gets closer and closer, and that's when I think you're going to see a lot of people putting their colours to the mast for the question of the national collective and support. And that's the way writers and artists think. You don't want to be. I don't know many writers in particular who want to be associated with a political party, for instance. One or two, I've done it myself. I helped found the Scottish Socialist Party. I'm not in a party anymore, but it's quite it's a big thing to nail something to your art in the public mind. If it's an organisation rather than an idea. People creative people like ideas rather than organisations. I don't know if I'm making it clear what I'm saying here, but maybe Rory will be able to give a better input into that from who you've dealt with at the National Collective specifically, and who's not quite wanting to come on board at this stage.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what's amazed me is how supportive the creative community and artistic communities have been of independence so far. And I think on the whole, I find it hard to think of more than a handful of well-known creative figures who are openly opposed to it. And in fact, on the whole, when I think of creative figures in independence, I think, well, they tend to be very supportive. I mean, Ross, one of the other co-founders of National Collective, one of his friends, I remember, challenged him he said, "Oh, I bet you can't name 10 artists who support independence." And Ross spent a while and came up with 50. And we published that, and it went viral pretty quickly.
It's interesting what Rory was saying about, if you look at the artists, high-profile artists who've come out against independence, the ones I can think of off the top of my head are probably J.K. Rowling, Ian Rankin, and, dare I say it, the very rich writers. The poorer ones haven't nailed their colours to the union at all. So I don't know. There's not that many. There's not that many have come out really for the union.
Is there any question of pressure being put on writers or other artists to sit on the fence or not to say anything? Like you're saying, a lot of them have chosen not to because they don't want to be associated with a particular organisation. But do you think there'd be any question of pressure from a publisher or something? Don't say anything on this.
There's a big problem in that. I would say there probably is, because a lot of Scottish artists. I mean, we have a great creative community, but there's still an enormous draw of London on the